On this exciting episode, car accident incapacitated your mother and killed your sister? In need of a divorce because you're stepping out with a wealthy socialite? Call Everett Durrell. Ambulance chaser, divorce lawyer, car driver, even when his lights are on the blink. This guy creates his own business. We'll be seeing lots of him in Perry Mason, Season 4, Episode 2, The Case of the Credulous Quarry. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy. My purpose? Pretty simple. Provide an audio companion to every episode of television's greatest legal drama, Perry Mason. Each episode, we give you a summary of the plot. We even compare plots with the Earl Stanley Gardner novel if the episode was an adaptation. We give you a little trivia, reveal the episode's theme, and revel in a Perry proverb. That's a pearl of wisdom from the man himself. Finally, we head to the water cooler where, just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we discuss the ins and outs of our fave legal cruise adventures. But first, say it with me, to the law library! Each time we visit the law library, we discuss a legal conundrum from Perry's case that helps us set future precedents. At the end of this episode, the case of the Credulous Quarry, our defendant has been found not guilty. We'd expect nothing less from Perry. But there's a little complication.
Both you and Durrell will have to face charges of tampering with evidence and obstructing police procedure.
Tampering with evidence and obstructing police procedure, eh? Let's see what the penalty for those two penal code violations are. Tampering with evidence, that's CPC 141, will get you up to 6 months in county jail and a fine of up to $1,000 or both. Obstructing police procedure, that's CPC 148, another misdemeanor charge, could include up to a year in county jail and a fine up to $1,000 or both. My guess is that Perry will get Dick Hammond and Everett Durrell out of jail time, but that they're both going to have to cough up some clams. Speaking of needing money, that's how Dick Hammond got into this whole thing in the first place. That means it's time to get to the plot of this episode. The Case of the Credulous Quarry. Richard Hammond's in trouble. Bills are piling up. His mom needs cash. He comes to his friend Everett Durrell, attorney at law, and explains his situation.
My mother needs care, Everett. She needs that sanitarium and a series of operations. Cost $15,000.
As listener Jason points out, here's Dick throwing some low-key shade Ev's way.
You know, it must be bad if I come to you.
Burn! That's one of those ambiguous lines like, I love you as much as I ever have. Which could be true, and it also could be a way of saying, I never loved you in the first place. Everett Durrell assures Richard he did all he could to get the settlement he got. But you know how things are for an ambulance chaser on the make. Everett does agree to front Dick $15,000, that's over $100,000 in today's cash, which is pretty sporting. But there's a Helen Austin problem. A former paramour of Mr. Durrell. And then Mr. Car Accident Attorney decides it's a good idea to still drive at night when his lights aren't working. Out pops Helen Austin's body, and now we're in deep doo-doo.
Oh, Dick, I'm in trouble.
Why? It was an accident, you said.
My fiancée, her family. I promised them I wouldn't see Helen anymore. They'll never believe that she wasn't here visiting me. What a mess. My career, my whole future ruined by a crazy thing like this.
Dick Hammond plays the gallant friend and agrees to hush up the whole thing. It's always dangerous when you hear a man say this.
Look, I know legally it isn't right. But nothing and nobody will be hurt by doing it this way.
Hammond plays it cool with the cops. He hits the hay feeling pretty good. But he wakes up to find his garage on fire. Ruh-roh. Inside his garage now are two cars, his and Everett Durrell's. Double ruh-roh. When he tries to check up on his man Ev, he can't find him. Triple ruh-roh. And then some strange woman with a Charlie Chaplin hat wants the $15,000 he took from Durrell. Quadruple ruh-roh. Better find an attorney that's not your conflicted interest covered friend. Time to call in Perry. And Perry's got some harsh words for his new client.
If the situation is as you put it, your position, both morally and legally, is indefensible.
Pretty soon it turns out Helen wasn't killed by the car, and Everett goes to actually being a hindrance. His papa-in-law-to-be puts the screws to him. We know something's up.
Everett, I don't think you and I ought to put the burden of decision on Barbara. I certainly won't. Barbara will do as I say. And I think you know how I feel.
Did I mention that Helen Austin was married before? She was, to a guy named Alexander Hill. Say hi to the people, Alexander.
I like nice things, Mason. I'll go without lunches to buy a good pair of shoes.
Did I also mention that Helen Austin was running around with Everett Durrell before he met and got engaged to wealthy socialite daughter Babs Claridge? He was. Okay, so let's clear up the whole car accident thing. Helen was in a car with her real paramour, wait for it, Marvin Claridge. Yep, the dad of Babs.
Then who was paying Helen Austin $2,000 a month for her silence, Mr. Durrell? Now, from whom was Helen going to get that $15,000?
All right. From the only one it could have been, Marvin Claridge.
The high and mighty socialite, you know, from the Brentwood district. It was Helen's fault that Dick's sister was killed and his mom is in such bad shape. And then talk about conflict of interest. Everett Durrell defended, wait a minute, he was dating the person who killed his friend's oh man, this gets tawdry.
I don't like to think of it like that. She never threatened me with exposing our affair. But perhaps that's one of the things I found so fascinating about Helen, that we understood each other so well.
But it wasn't Marvin Claridge. It wasn't Everett Durrell who killed Helen. Nope, that was Helen's former husband, Alexander Hill. Stick it to him, Perry.
The cheat. The cheat!
You made a pretty good pair.
As mentioned before, Dick and Ev get off for Helen's death, but they'll have to pay the penalty for playing tricky with the body. Quick, escort him out of the country, Paul!
Can I drop you any place, Mr. Hammond?
Well, thank you.
Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is a deep dive on an actor or actress who guest starred in the episode. And a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul for this episode involves the tangled web of Los Angeles high society. The Claridges hail from a particular part of LA, and their holdover Everett Durrell involves access to said high society. Tell us more.
Barbara's the daughter of Marvin Claridge, chairman of the board. Very dignified Brentwood society.
Okay, Paul Prompt. Tell us what you can find out about Brentwood. What kind of people live there? How did they move and shake? Is this still a hangout for the high and mighty of LA? Our Della for this episode is none other than John Conwell. Our defendant, Richard Hammond.
Maybe there are no mitigating circumstances in law, but there are in my life.
Here's 10 about John. He was born June 6th, 1922 in Chicago, Illinois. He attended college in New Mexico. Number 2, casting guru David Graham claimed to have found Conwell as an actor working in Portsmouth, New Hampshire at the Players' Ring. Graham, in that anecdote, boasted that Conwell was one of the best casting directors in television. And that gives us a hint of where this bio's going. Number 3, Conwell appeared in the first episode of Twilight Zone. But then did not appear as an actor in other episodes because he was an assistant to the producer on several episodes. The acting credits for John Conwell, not very deep. In fact, this guy moved and shook behind the camera. Listen to this about who this guy discovered. David Worf, in a examination of Quinn Martin Productions, said this about Conwell. He was kind of like the keeper of the zoo. He maintained that coterie of characters from Brad Dillman to all the people who worked the Quinn Martin shows. He was a stage actor who brought big name stars like Robert Duvall, Cicely Tyson, and Gene Hackman to Quinn Martin Productions and television. Pretty cool. Number 5. Here's the relationship between Quinn Martin and John Conwell. Quinn Martin was fond of John. John was no less fond of Quinn. Apparently, they would go to lunch all the time at either Tail of the Cock or Musso Frank's. Number 6, he was a casting director in particular for the show FBI. And he apparently gave a gig to Burt Remsen, the man who eventually hired Harrison Ford for a part in the show FBI, starring Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. Number 7, another show that John Conwell was casting director for, Bold and the Beautiful. That's right, soap opera Bold and the Beautiful. Apparently, number 8 here, Conwell's small film appearance in Run Silent, Run Deep led him to meet Bill Raish, the man who was most famous as the one-arm man in The Fugitive. That's why Conwell cast him. Number 9, he was married to Mae Maxine Runyon. He was engaged to actress Kim Stanley. Here's a notice from a Kim Stanley biography. Kim Stanley, Lillian Gish, John Conwell all appeared in a stage version of The Trip to Bountiful, where Conwell was a henpecked son of Gish. Conwell was no stranger to Kim, the biography says. He had been her fiancé when they were leading man and lady of the University of Mexico drama department during World War II. And number 10, he died on November 27th, 1994 in Santa Barbara, California. What an interesting deep dive. There was no single source that gave me all this information about Conwell. His name was sprinkled in about 7 or 8 different books that I found using books.google.com. If you've got any more information on this guy, let me know. Fascinating character. What do we learn about Perry in this episode? At least 2 things. Number 1, he's apparently not the only lawyer on his floor at the Brett Building, but I gotta say, I don't think foot traffic will be heading from his door over to Everett Durrell's office after this case. And number 2...
If the court please, counsel realizes the defense doesn't usually put on its case at this time, but the unusual aspects of this case would seem to make it an advantage rather than a disadvantage.
Then you want to put on a defense, Mr. Mason?
Yes, Your Honor.
Typical Perry MO is to hijack Hamilton or the prosecutor's case while the prosecutor is showing evidence. Perry just butts in and starts calling his own witnesses. Here, he actually puts on his own witnesses as part of the defense. The theme for this episode, credulity, of course. It means willingness to believe. Our boy Dick Hammond rides the pendulum from gullible to skeptical, all in one fell swoop, particularly where it concerns his friend Everett Durrell. Meanwhile, they're both Quarry for the episode's 2 major schnooks, Marvin Claridge and Alexander Hill. I'd say it's better to be too credulous in Perry's world than too skeptical, especially if Perry's there to befriend you. I wouldn't advise being the gloomy type like Trag.
Then you just suspect murder.
I guess I'm the gloomy type.
Really, of course, it's a matter of who you believe, not if you believe. Everyone has to trust somebody, to paraphrase Bob Dylan. The infuriating thing about the cops in Berger is they never doubt their own doubt of Perry. Well, guess who ends up pounding rocks by the end of this episode? Now, let's hear a Perry proverb. Here's a jewel from Proverbs 23. In the blink of an eye, wealth disappears, for it will sprout wings and fly away like an eagle. Perry hints at the bogus priorities greed gives you in this short and sweet proverb, where he exchanges barbs with Alexander Hill.
That's a beautiful shirt. Oh, you like it? Silk, isn't it? And that necktie.
The tie costs $17.50. I like nice things, Mason. I'll go without lunches to buy a good pair of shoes.
And without cigarettes to buy a gold lighter.
Perry will call shenanigans on that every day of the week. Never trust a man who passes on cigarettes to buy a gold lighter. You heard it here first. Now, let's head to the water cooler.
No, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Each time we visit the water cooler, we give you deleted scenes, humorous outtakes that didn't quite make the final cut. Listeners Jason and Tom give us a couple here. In our first one, Clara Thorpe does a Charlie Chaplin tramp imitation as she walks out of Perry's office.
Mason, if I knew that, perhaps I could find another 15,000 the same place.
Hamilton and Tragg go back and forth about the murder weapon in our second outtake.
Now, Doctor, I ask you if this stone used as a weapon could have been the cause of death.
I show you now this shopping cart of groceries found behind the defendant's house and identified as possible murder weapons. I show you now this government surplus Mark III torpedo found behind the defendant's house. I show you now this life-size bust of Voltaire found behind the defendant's house. And finally, you know it's coming, right? Alexander Hill gives Perry a flashback of all the irrational exchanges he's made in his life. There was that old olive oil dispenser made by Tiffany's that left him without cash to actually buy olive oil. There was that time he purchased 4 perfectly great tires from Goodyear, but didn't have cash for a car. And then finally, there's that time he bought a terrific set of doors, but didn't have money for a house. Our Paul prompt from last time investigates Patty's Romance, the 13th Carolyn Wells novel in the Patty series. Oh, you remember the Patty series, don't you? Yeah, well, this was number 13. And you'll recall it's the book in the hands of the secretary at the Tool and Die business when Harley Bassett calls.
Domestic tool and die.
A review from Goodreads of this book. Apparently, there are fans out there consuming every Patty's Romance novel they can get their hand on. Reveals that the theme of this one is, quote, Patty in trouble, please rescue. She's kidnapped and held for ransom. She gets taken by one of her favorite suitors out for a vacation only to be abandoned on an island. Eventually, things work out and she gets home all right. She's only 20 years old. The series was apparently meant for girls. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why a grown woman like the secretary in the episode is reading the book, if that's the case. But there don't seem to be any overt connections to the Perry plot. But now I know what secretaries in 1960 were reading, or at least those were the books that were available from the prop master. And now let's get to some listener letters. Our House podcast lawyer, Tom Wiltshire, has some thoughts on the case of the treacherous toupee. By the way, some of you have been doing this where after the episode is over, you send me your thoughts. I absolutely love it. It provides some great post-show commentary. So all these thoughts are about the case of the treacherous toupee. He points out there's a record-breaking parade of broken marriages. Hartley and Sybil Bassett, Ken Woodman and his wife, Wilbur Fennick and serial wife Teddy, and then, of course, Dick Hart and Teddy. That's a grand total of 4 marriages down the drain in one episode. No wonder Perry, Paul, and Del are single. there's the red herring of these particular guest stars all saying they would have murdered or liked to murder Hartley Bassett. There's Sybil, Dick, Woodman, and Dawson. The only other major role who doesn't say that, it's Colmar. Giveaway. And then here was a fun little bit. Tom traces the history of this plane we see come in from Honolulu to Los Angeles. It's a Boeing 707. It was apparently used by Pan Am. It worked for British Midland Airways, Sudan Airways, Iraqi Airways, Nigeria Airways, all used it until it was scrapped in September 1980. Delightful. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Do you have a comment on the episode or the pod in general? You can drop me a line at theperrypod@gmail.com. Next time, some Perry episode guides list the next episode as the true inaugural episode of the 4th season. Why? Because it's the first to feature a super cool opening credit sequence. Join us for it, won't you? It's the case of the ill-fated faker. Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!